8-year-old Sophie Mitchell bounced excitedly beside her mother as they approached Buckingham Palace on a crisp Saturday morning in October. The little girl wore her favorite pink dress and clutched a small disposable camera her grandmother had given her for the trip to London. This was Sophie's first visit to see the famous royal guards, and she had spent weeks imagining what they would look like in their tall black hats and red uniforms. "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart?" her mother Helen reminded her gently. "The guards are working, so we need to be respectful and keep our distance. You can take pictures, but we mustn't disturb them." Sophie nodded eagerly, but her 8-year-old attention was already captured by the magnificent sight before her.
Ow.
2 royal guards stood at attention outside the palace gates, their ceremonial uniforms immaculate and their expressions stern and focused. To Sophie's young eyes, they looked like something from a fairy tale. The Mitchell family had traveled from their small town in Yorkshire for this special weekend trip. Helen, a single mother working 2 jobs to make ends meet, had saved for months. To afford the train tickets and modest hotel room, she wanted to give Sophie a memorable experience and had planned every detail of their London adventure carefully. Guard Thomas Ashworth had been standing at his post for 2 hours, maintaining the perfect posture and unwavering focus that his training demanded. At 26, he had served in the Royal Guards for 4 years and took immense pride in the precision and discipline required for ceremonial duties. The steady stream of tourists was nothing unusual. Hundreds of people photographed the guards. Every day, Sophie approached the barriers that kept tourists at a safe distance from the guards, her camera ready. She had practiced taking pictures with her grandmother back home, and she was determined to get the perfect shot to show her classmates when she returned to school. "Mummy, can you lift me up so I can see better?" Sophie whispered, tugging at her mother's sleeve. Helen glanced around at the other tourists, noting how crowded the area had become. "Let's wait for some of these people to move, and then I'll help you get a good picture." But Sophie's 8-year-old patience had its limits. She had been looking forward to this moment for weeks, and the sight of the impressive guards was more exciting than she had imagined. As more tourists gathered around the barriers, Sophie found herself pushed further back, unable to see clearly over the heads of adults. "I can't see," Sophie whispered urgently to her mother. "All these tall people are in my way." Helen tried to find a better position, but the crowd continued to grow as tour groups arrived. Weekend visits to the palace always drew large crowds, and today seemed busier than usual. Sophie's excitement was turning to frustration as her view remained blocked. Thomas maintained his stoic expression, but his trained eyes noticed the little girl in the pink dress struggling to see over the crowd. He had observed countless children during his service, and he recognized the disappointment on her face as taller people blocked her view. Sophie noticed a small gap in the barriers where she might be able to squeeze through for just a moment. Long enough to take one quick picture from a better angle, the gap was barely wide enough for a small child, and most adults hadn't even noticed it existed. "Mummy, there's a space right there." Sophie pointed to the gap. "I could just quickly run through and take one picture." "Absolutely not, Sophie," Helen replied firmly. "Those barriers are there for a reason. We need to stay where tourists are supposed to be." But as Helen turned to ask a nearby guard for advice about better viewing areas for children, Sophie made a decision that seemed perfectly reasonable to her 8-year-old mind. If she could just get a little closer for one quick photograph, she would have the perfect picture to show everyone back home. Sophie slipped through the small gap in the barriers, with the quick movements that only children possess. Before her mother realized what was happening, the little girl was standing much closer to the guards than any tourist was supposed to be. Thomas immediately noticed the breach in security protocol. His training kicked in automatically. Any unauthorized person entering the restricted area represented a potential threat that had to be addressed according to strict procedures. But he also recognized that this was clearly a child who had simply gotten too excited about taking a picture. "Sophie," Helen called out in alarm, realizing what her daughter had done. "Come back here immediately." Sophie raised her small camera, trying to frame the perfect shot of the impressive guard standing so tall and still in his magnificent uniform. She was completely focused on getting the picture she had dreamed of taking, unaware that her innocent action had created a serious breach of royal security protocols. Thomas faced a split-second decision. His training demanded that he respond to any security breach with immediate action, but his common sense told him this was just an excited child who meant no harm. However, security procedures existed for everyone's safety, and exceptions could not be made even for innocent children. The little girl stepped even closer, trying to get the best angle for her photograph. And in her excitement, she reached out to steady herself by briefly touching the edge of Thomas's trouser leg. The moment Sophie's small hand touched Thomas's uniform, everything changed. Palace security cameras captured the contact, and within seconds, additional guards were moving toward their position. What had seemed like an innocent child's excitement was now being treated as a serious security incident. Please step back immediately," Thomas said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of his position while trying to remain calm. He could see that Sophie was just a child, but protocol demanded that he treat any unauthorized contact as a potential threat. Sophie looked up at Thomas with wide, confused eyes. She had simply wanted to take a picture and had touched his leg. For balance, her young mind, she couldn't understand why the nice guard seemed upset with her. "I'm sorry," Sophie said in a small voice, stepping backward toward the barriers. "I just wanted a picture with you. You look like a prince from my storybooks." Helen pushed through the crowd of tourists who had gathered to watch the commotion. Her heart was racing with panic and embarrassment as she realized the seriousness of what had happened. "Sophie, come here right now. I'm so sorry, officer. She's just excited. She meant no harm." But the situation was already escalating beyond what anyone had anticipated. Palace Security Supervisor Inspector Davies approached rapidly, his radio crackling with reports about the breach. Behind him came additional guards and what appeared to be plainclothes security officers. "Ma'am, I need you and your daughter too. Step away from the barriers immediately," Inspector Davies instructed Helen with professional authority. "We need to discuss this incident with you both." The crowd of tourists began taking pictures and recording videos of the unfolding scene. What had started as Sophie's innocent attempt to get a good photograph was rapidly becoming a spectacle that was being documented by dozens of strangers. Thomas remained at his post, maintaining his professional demeanor, but he felt increasingly concerned about how the situation was developing. He could see that Sophie was beginning to cry, and her mother looked terrified by the official response to what had clearly been a harmless mistake. "Please, sir," Helen pleaded with Inspector Davies. "My daughter is only 8 years old. She didn't mean any harm, she just wanted a picture. We're tourists from Yorkshire, and this is her first time seeing the Royal Guards." Inspector Davies understood that this was almost certainly an innocent incident, but security protocols existed for important reasons. Any unauthorized contact with Royal Guards had to be thoroughly investigated and documented, regardless of the age or apparent innocence of the person involved. "Ma'am, I understand this appears to be harmless, but we have procedures that must be followed when anyone makes unauthorized contact with our guards. We'll need to take statements from you and your daughter, and there may be additional consequences." Sophie began crying harder as she realized that her simple desire for a photograph had created serious trouble for her mother. The little girl's tears and obvious distress began attracting sympathetic attention from the gathered tourists, some of whom started expressing disapproval of the security response. "She's just a child," called out an elderly woman from the crowd. "Surely you can see she didn't mean any harm." "This is ridiculous," added a middle-aged man with a camera. "Poor little girl just wanted a picture. Why are you treating her like a criminal?" Thomas could hear the crowd's growing disapproval, and he felt torn between his duty to follow protocols and his human instinct to protect a distressed child. Sophie's innocent touch had created a situation that was spiraling far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Inspector Davies gestured for Helen and Sophie to follow him to a private area where they could discuss the incident away from the growing crowd of onlookers. As they walked, Sophie clutched her mother's hand tightly, her small camera forgotten in her other hand. "Mummy, am I in trouble?" Sophie whispered through her tears. "I didn't mean to do anything wrong. I just wanted a picture to show Grandma." Helen's heart broke as she realized that their special weekend in London had turned into a nightmare for her young daughter. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. We'll sort this out." But even as Helen tried to reassure Sophie, She was beginning to understand that the consequences of her daughter's innocent action might be more serious than either of them had imagined. Palace security protocols were not designed to make exceptions. For children, and any breach of royal security procedures could have lasting implications. Thomas watched them being led away and felt a growing sense of unease about what he had witnessed. He had followed proper procedures in reporting the unauthorized contact, but he wondered if the response was proportional to what had clearly been innocent mistake by an excited child. The incident was already being posted on social media by tourists who had recorded the confrontation. Videos showing a crying 8-year-old being questioned by security officers were beginning to spread online, though the full context of the situation wasn't always accurately represented in the brief. Clips. In the security office, Inspector Davies conducted a formal interview with Helen and Sophie, documenting every detail of the incident for the official report. Sophie sat in an oversized chair, her legs dangling and her eyes red from crying, while her mother tried to answer questions about their visit and her daughter's intentions. "Mrs. Mitchell, you understand that unauthorized contact with royal guards is a serious security breach," Inspector Davies explained, his tone professional but not unkind. "We need to establish that this was genuinely accidental and that there was no intent to interfere with royal security." Helen felt overwhelmed by the formal language and official procedures. She was a working-class single mother who had never dealt with anything more serious than school discipline issues. And now she found herself being questioned by palace security about her daughter's actions. "Inspector, Sophie is 8 years old," Helen said, her voice shaking slightly. "Never been to London before. She saved her pocket money for weeks to buy that camera so she could take pictures of the guards. She honestly thought they were like characters from her fairy tale books." Sophie remained silent during most of the questioning, intimidated by the official surroundings and formal tone of the proceedings. When Inspector Davies asked her directly why she had touched the guard's uniform, her answer was heartbreakingly simple. "I was trying not to fall down," Sophie whispered. "The camera was heavy, and I wanted to take a good picture. I just touched his leg for 1 second to keep my balance. I didn't know I wasn't supposed to." Inspector Davies completed his report, noting that the incident appeared to be accidental and involved no malicious intent. However, the formal documentation process had taken nearly 2 hours, during which time the social media response to videos of the incident had begun escalating dramatically. Unknown to Helen and Sophie, the tourist-recorded videos were being shared thousands of times across various platforms. Many viewers were outraged by what appeared to be harsh treatment of an innocent child, while others defended the guards need to maintain strict security protocols. The headlines on social media posts were becoming increasingly sensationalized. 8-year-old girl arrested for touching royal guard and palace security terrorizes young tourist. These posts often lacked context about the actual security procedures or the fact that Sophie had not been arrested. When Helen and Sophie were finally released from the security office, they discovered that their nightmare was just beginning. Outside the palace gates, a small crowd of journalists and photographers had gathered. Alerted by the viral social media coverage of the incident, "Mrs. Mitchell, Mrs. Mitchell," reporters called out, as Helen tried to shield Sophie from the cameras. "How do you feel about your daughter being detained by palace security? Will you be filing a complaint about the treatment she received?" Helen was completely unprepared for media attention. She had never spoken to reporters before and didn't understand how the incident had become a news story. All she wanted was to take Sophie back to their hotel and salvage what remained of their weekend trip. "Please leave us alone," Helen pleaded, holding Sophie close as they tried to navigate through the crowd of journalists. "My daughter has been through enough today. Just want to go back to our hotel." But the media attention was already beyond their control. News outlets were picking up the story, often with headlines that painted the palace security response in the most negative possible light. The nuanced reality of security protocols and the actual details of what had occurred were being lost in the rush to create compelling content. Sophie, already traumatized by the formal questioning, became even more distressed by the shouting, reporters and flashing cameras. The little girl who had started the day excited about seeing fairy tale guards was now hiding her face against her mother's shoulder. crying and begging to go home. Thomas, still at his post, could see the media circus developing outside the palace gates. He felt increasingly troubled by the way the situation was unfolding, knowing that his adherence to proper procedures had somehow contributed to a small child being thrust into an unwanted spotlight back at their modest hotel. Helen tried to comfort Sophie while fielding phone calls from reporters who had somehow obtained their contact information. The phone rang constantly with requests for interviews, comments, and photo opportunities. "Mummy, why are all these people calling us?" Sophie asked, confused by the attention. "Did I do something really bad? Are we in trouble with the Queen?" Helen struggled to explain the situation to her young daughter. How could she help Sophie understand that her innocent desire for a photograph had somehow become a national news story that was being discussed by strangers around the world? The hotel manager approached Helen in the lobby, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm afraid we have reporters gathering outside and it's disturbing our other guests. You may need to discuss alternative arrangements for your stay." The realization hit Helen like a physical blow. They were being driven out of their hotel because of unwanted media attention surrounding her 8-year-old daughter's innocent mistake. Their special weekend in London had become a complete disaster. Sophie overheard the conversation and began crying again. "Mummy, I'm sorry I touched the guard. I didn't know it would make everyone angry. I just wanted a picture to show my friends." At school, as Helen held her sobbing daughter, she began to understand that the consequences of this incident might extend far beyond their ruined weekend trip. The viral nature of social media meant that Sophie's face and their story were now known to thousands of strangers who had formed opinions about their situation based on incomplete information. When Helen and Sophie returned to their small Yorkshire town 3 days early, they discovered that the media storm had followed them home. Local reporters were waiting at the train station, and their neighbors had been approached for comments about the palace incident involving little Sophie Mitchell. Sophie's school principal, Mrs. Henderson, called Helen that evening with concerning news. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm afraid we need to discuss Sophie's return to school tomorrow. Several parents have contacted me with questions about the incident in London. There are concerns about media attention affecting our other students." The weight of the situation crashed down on Helen as she realized that her daughter's innocent mistake was now affecting her education and their entire community. Sophie was supposed to start 3rd grade the next day, but instead of excitement about seeing her friends and sharing stories about London, she was facing unwanted scrutiny and attention. "Principal Henderson, Sophie is just a child who made an innocent mistake," Helen said desperately. She doesn't understand why everyone is treating her like she did something terrible. All she wanted was a picture with the royal guards. Meanwhile, the social media response had taken on a life of its own. The original videos had been viewed millions of times, with people around the world expressing outrage at what they perceived as heavy-handed treatment of an innocent child. Online comment sections were filled with criticism of British palace security and expressions of sympathy for Sophie. However, the viral nature of the story also attracted less sympathetic attention. Some social media users began criticizing Helen's parenting, questioning why she hadn't kept better control of her daughter. Others made cruel comments about Sophie's appearance and behavior, with the anonymity of the internet allowing people to express opinions they would never voice in person. Thomas had been following the media coverage with growing concern and guilt. What had seemed like proper adherence to security protocols at the time now felt like a massive overreaction that had caused serious harm to an innocent family. He found himself losing sleep over the situation. Colonel Patricia Ashford, commanding officer of the Royal Guards, called Thomas into her office to discuss the incident and its aftermath. The palace was facing significant negative publicity, and there were questions about whether the security response had been proportional to the actual threat posed by an 8-year-old child. "Guard Ashworth," Colonel Ashford began, "you followed proper procedures in reporting the security breach, and your conduct was professional throughout. However, we need to consider whether our protocols adequately account for situations involving young children who pose no genuine threat." Thomas appreciated the support from his commanding officer. but he couldn't shake the feeling that he bore some responsibility for the family's current ordeal. "Ma'am, I keep thinking there must have been a way to handle the situation that wouldn't have resulted in this media circus." At Sophie's school, the situation became increasingly difficult. Other children had seen the news coverage and began asking Sophie questions she couldn't answer. Some parents instructed their children to avoid Sophie, concerned about the negative attention surrounding her family. "Why can't I play with Emma today?" Sophie asked her teacher, Miss Roberts, when her best friend was kept inside during recess. "Did I do something wrong to Emma too?" Miss Roberts struggled to explain the adult complexities of media attention and social judgment to an 8-year-old who simply couldn't understand why touching a guard's uniform for balance it created so much trouble for everyone around her. Family's financial situation also began deteriorating. Helen had to take time off work to deal with media requests and the emotional needs of her traumatized daughter. Their modest savings, already depleted by the London trip, couldn't sustain the loss of income from Helen's to part-time jobs. Worse yet, one of Helen's employers, a small local business, expressed concerns about the negative publicity associated with having her as an employee. The business owner worried that customers might react poorly to the association with the viral Palace incident. "Helen, I think you're a wonderful person and a hard worker," her employer said awkwardly. "But some of our customers have been making comments about the situation with Sophie. I'm concerned it might affect business." The cruel irony wasn't lost on Helen. They had spent months saving money for a special trip to create happy memories. And instead, they had created a situation that was destroying their livelihood and their daughter's childhood innocence. Sophie began experiencing nightmares about guards and cameras. She developed anxiety about being in public places where people might recognize her from the viral videos. The confident, outgoing child who had been excited about photographing royal guards was becoming withdrawn and fearful. "Mummy, I don't want to go to school anymore," Sophie confided one evening. "The other kids keep asking me questions, and some of them are mean to me. They say I'm the girl who got in trouble with the Queen." Helen realized that her daughter was being defined by a single moment of childhood excitement that had been blown completely out of proportion by media attention in public judgment. The 8-year-old girl who had simply wanted a photograph was now carrying the weight of a national controversy. The psychological impact on Sophie was becoming increasingly apparent. She stopped playing with her toys, lost interest in activities she had previously enjoyed, and became clingy and anxious whenever Helen left her sight. The trauma of the formal questioning, media attention, and social rejection was taking a serious toll on the young child's mental health. Thomas couldn't continue his duties without addressing the guilt he felt about Sophie's situation. After much internal struggle, he requested permission to write a personal letter to the Mitchell family, hoping to somehow make amends for the trauma his adherence to protocol had caused. "Dear Mrs. Mitchell and Sophie," Thomas wrote carefully, "I am the royal guard who was on duty when Sophie touched my uniform. I have been following the news about your family, and I am deeply sorry for the pain this incident has caused you both. Sophie did nothing wrong. She was simply an excited child who wanted a photograph." Colonel Ashford initially hesitated to allow the letter to be sent, concerned about potential policy implications, but she ultimately recognized that Thomas's genuine remorse and desire to help represented the best values of military service. The letter was forwarded to the Mitchell family through official channels. When Helen received Thomas's letter, she broke down crying, not from sadness this time, but from relief that someone in authority acknowledged the injustice of what had happened to her daughter. For weeks she had felt like the world was against them, treating Sophie as if she had committed a serious crime rather than made an innocent childhood mistake. "Sophie, listen to this," Helen said, reading portions of the letter aloud. "The guard says you did nothing wrong, and he's sorry that people have been mean to you about what happened. He says you were just being a normal little girl who wanted a picture." Sophie's response to the letter revealed how deeply the incident had affected her. "Does he really think I'm not a bad girl? Everyone at school says I got in trouble with the Queen, and that's why we had to leave London early," the letter prompted Helen to seek professional help for Sophie, who was clearly struggling with anxiety and self-blame that no 8-year-old should have to carry. A child psychologist confirmed Helen's fears. Sophie was experiencing trauma symptoms related to the overwhelming adult reaction to her innocent action. Meanwhile, Thomas had been quietly researching the Mitchell family's situation and was horrified to learn about the extent of the damage caused by the media attention. He discovered that Helen had lost one of her jobs. Sophie was being bullied at school, and the family was facing financial hardship as a direct result of the viral coverage. Determined to take meaningful action, Thomas used his personal time and resources to organize a fundraising effort among his fellow guards. Many of his colleagues had also been troubled by the excessive response to Sophie's innocent mistake and wanted to help make things right. "We all know that little girl meant no harm," said Sergeant Williams, contributing to the collection. "Happened to her family could happen to any of us if our own children made similar innocent mistakes. We need to support them." The fundraising effort among the Royal Guards attracted attention from military families and veterans organizations, who recognized the injustice of the situation and wanted to help. Within weeks, a substantial fund had been established to help the Mitchell family recover from the financial impact of the media attention. But Thomas wanted to do more than provide financial assistance. He requested permission to visit Sophie personally to apologize for the trauma she had experienced, and to help her understand that she had done nothing wrong. The request was unprecedented, but Colonel Ashford approved it as an act of military compassion. The visit was arranged quietly, away from media attention, at a neutral location where Sophie would feel comfortable. When Thomas arrived in civilian clothes rather than his intimidating uniform, Sophie's first reaction was surprise. He looked like a normal and kind young man, rather than the stern, imposing figure she remembered. "Sophie, I wanted to tell you in person that you did absolutely nothing wrong that day," Thomas said gently, kneeling to her eye level. "You were just excited about taking a picture, and that's exactly what any child your age would do. I'm sorry that the grown-ups made such a big fuss about it." For the first time since the incident, Sophie began to relax when talking about what had happened. "I was scared when all those people started asking me questions," she admitted. "I thought I was going to jail because I touched your uniform." Thomas's heart broke as he realized the extent of the fear and confusion this child had been carrying. "Sophie, you were never going to jail, and you never did anything that any reasonable person would consider wrong. Sometimes grown-ups have rules that don't make sense when children are involved." The personal meeting began Sophie's emotional healing process. Having the actual guard tell her that she wasn't in trouble and hadn't done anything wrong helped her begin to overcome the anxiety, self-blame that had been consuming her for months. Thomas also used his platform as the guard involved in the incident to speak publicly about the disproportionate response Sophie had faced. His statements to the media helped shift public opinion and reduce some of the negative attention the family had been receiving. "The real story here isn't about security protocols or royal procedures," Thomas told reporters. "It's about how social media and public judgment can destroy the life of an innocent child who made a perfectly normal mistake. Sophie Mitchell deserves our protection, not our criticism." Child advocacy groups began using Sophie's case as an example of how viral social media attention could cause serious harm to minors, calling for greater protections for children who became unwilling subjects of public controversy through no fault of their own. 6 months after the incident, Sophie's life had begun to stabilize, though the family would never completely return to their previous anonymity. Thomas's public support and the fundraising efforts of his fellow guards had provided both financial relief and emotional healing for the Mitchell family. The palace, recognizing the damage caused by the excessive response to Sophie's innocent action, implemented new protocols for handling incidents involving young children. Colonel Ashford worked with child psychology experts to develop guidelines that balanced security needs with appropriate treatment of minors who posed no genuine threat. The Sophie Mitchell case taught us that rigid adherence to adult protocols can cause serious harm when applied to children's natural behavior, Colonel Ashford explained in a policy briefing. "We've revised our procedures to ensure that future incidents involving young children are handled with greater sensitivity and proportion." Sophie slowly returned to being a normal 8-year-old, though she remained more reserved than she had been before the incident. The trauma counseling helped her understand that the adult world's reaction to her actions had been unfair and disproportionate. Allowing her to release the guilt and self-blame she had been carrying, Thomas continued to maintain contact with the family, becoming an unexpected family friend who helped Sophie see royal guards as real people rather than intimidating figures. His genuine care and concern helped repair some of the damage caused by her traumatic experience with authority figures. "Uncle Thomas," Sophie asked during one of his visits. Using the nickname she had given him, "Why did everyone get so angry about me touching your uniform? I still don't really understand." Thomas explained in terms an 8-year-old could grasp. Sometimes grown-ups have rules that make sense for dangerous situations. But we forget to think about whether those rules make sense when children are just being children. What happened to you taught all of us to think more carefully about how we treat kids. The media attention that had initially destroyed their peace eventually brought some positive outcomes. Publishers approached Helen about writing a children's book about Sophie's experience, aimed at helping other children understand that making mistakes doesn't make them bad people. Sophie's story became part of digital citizenship curricula in schools, teaching students about the potential consequences of viral social media content and the importance of thinking before sharing content involving children. Her experience helped protect other children from similar trauma. Helen found new employment with an organization that advocated for children's rights in digital media, using her family's experience to help develop policies protecting minors from harmful viral attention. The work gave meaning to their ordeal by helping prevent similar situations for other families. The financial support from the guards' fundraising effort allowed Helen to move Sophie to a private school where she wasn't known as the Palace Girl, giving her a fresh start with new classmates who knew her simply as Sophie rather than as a viral news story. 2 years later, Sophie was thriving in her new environment. She had regained her confidence and curiosity, though she remained more thoughtful about public behavior and was more aware of how quickly situations could escalate beyond anyone's control. Thomas received a commendation for his handling of the aftermath of the incident, with officials recognizing that his personal efforts to help the Mitchell family represented the highest ideals of military service, protecting and serving those who needed help. Even when it meant going beyond official duties, the palace established the Sophie Mitchell Foundation, dedicated to protecting children who become unwilling subjects of viral media attention. The foundation provided counseling services, legal support, and advocacy for families facing similar situations. On the 3rd anniversary of the incident, Sophie wrote a letter to Thomas that he treasured. "Dear Uncle Thomas, thank you for helping me understand that I'm not a bad person. Sometimes I think about that scary day, but mostly I remember how you came to help me feel better. I'm not afraid of guards anymore because I know they're really just nice people doing their jobs." Sophie's case led to broader changes in how social media platforms handled content involving minors, with new policies requiring greater consideration before allowing viral spread of videos featuring children in potentially embarrassing or harmful situations. The small, disposable camera that had started the entire ordeal remained in Sophie's bedroom as a reminder of how quickly life could change. But rather than representing trauma, it had come to symbolize resilience and the power of compassion to heal damage caused by misunderstanding and overreaction. Helen often spoke at conferences about digital media responsibility, sharing Sophie's story as a cautionary tale about the real human cost of viral content. "Behind every viral video is a real person with real feelings," she would tell audiences. In our case, it was an 8-year-old child who just wanted a picture with a fairy tale guard. Thomas continued his service with the Royal Guards, but he carried Sophie's lesson with him in every interaction with the public, especially children. He had learned that true service meant protecting people, not just from physical threats, but from the sometimes cruel judgment of a world that could turn a child's innocent mistake into a life-faltering ordeal. Sophie grew up to become an advocate for children's digital rights, using her early experience to help create a more compassionate online world where children's mistakes weren't turned into public entertainment. Her childhood trauma had been transformed into a lifelong mission to protect other children from similar harm. The girl who had once tugged a royal guard's pants for a photo had indeed had her life changed by that moment, but through compassion, advocacy, and the kindness of unexpected allies, She had ultimately used that change to make the world a little safer for other children facing the overwhelming power of viral media attention.